Yo le dije en el título de mi ponencia a Alberto que iba a hablar sobre la reescritura del Capital de Linera, pero no voy a hacer. Voy a hablar de el conflicto entre forma, lo informe y el Estado, ¿sí? Y voy a hablar en inglés. Yesterday, Oscar Vega spoke to us about the regreso de la Bolivia plebeya. He used a phrase with which I want to open my remarks today. He said that el regreso de la Bolivia plebeya was the return of what had never left. It was there, and nevertheless it had to return. The question about the plebs is the question about the limits of representation. For that reason, it is a question about the state and what it is capable of, or what we think it is capable of doing. We do not know what a state is capable of, though we know about some of the things that states have done and continue to do. We know, for instance, that a state is able to address identitarian demands. We know that it is a heterogeneous site with a disarticulated moving parts. Oscar also talked to us about that yesterday. I don't think that we know if a state can open itself up to the singular or to anything that doesn't already mirror its form in some way. Perhaps the Bolivian process that is underway will be defined by this relaunching of the problem of the state as perhaps an eventual site. Perhaps. Today I will suggest that if the work of Álvaro García Linera is a dependable guide to this problem as it unfolds day to day on the ground, then the odds are that the answer is no. The plebs have returned to the place where they had always and never been. The state has been sundered and reshaped by this return. Everything hinges on the possible believability of a fiction. That a structure like the Bolivian state under the guidance of Evo Morales and Mas is in fact the expression of the will of a vast majority of the various nations of Bolivia. Pablo Stefani and Hervé Dualto affirmed this hope in the following terms. La izquierda que ocupa hoy el Palacio Quemado no es la izquierda criolla partidista y de raíz marxista de antaño, sino un archipiélago de movimientos sociales y sindicales con ritmos, culturas políticas y objetivos no siempre coincidentes ni fáciles de articular. No son partidos que se insertan en el movimiento social para articularse con él, sino que salen de él. And yet, out of the social movements, being the expression of their multiplicity and lack of articulation also means to come out of an insufficiency. The statal structure that emerges insofar as the ideological apparatuses are concerned insists on the insufficient form from which it has emerged as the embodiment of order. Álvaro García Linera, writing as vice president in 2008, writes, "No society can live permanently in mobilization as the anarchists hold. There may be instability, struggles, but at some point an orderly structure must be consolidated." Elsewhere, he insists, la estatalidad was once dreamt by el anarquismo primitivo. La ingenuidad de la sociedad por fuera del Estado no pasaría de ser una inocente especulación si no fuera porque en ello se olvida o se esconde que el Estado vive de los recursos de toda la sociedad. Asigna jerárquicamente estos bienes en función de la fuerza de la totalidad de las fracciones sociales y consagra el acceso a esos poderes por medio de la coerción que ejerce y la legitimidad que obtiene de la totalidad de los miembros de la sociedad. El Estado es pues una relación social total, no solamente la ambición de los capaces o los sedientos de poder. El Estado nos atraviesa a todos de algún modo, de ahí su contenido público. The need to clarify this is not the old state, that something unheard of is taking place in this new iteration of the total social relation, is not only a necessary fiction in order to govern. Theoretically, we are told it is essential in order to make the communist horizon and the contours of our present appear. In the actuality of communism, Bruno Hostiles goes to great lengths to save García Linera from any possible melancholic reading of this state as, say, an oppressive reincarnation of the classic socialist state. This deviation, the leftist deviation, has to be corrected, or we risk the possibility of understanding the Bolivian experiment as a ghostly spirit from the dead past. Leftism for Bostiles is a tradition whose non-subjective categories put representational structures in crisis: the formless masses, the rabble, the multitude, the lumpen proletariat, and so on. In a nutshell, leftism is the tradition, and this is a quote, the tradition in which political antagonism is purified into a stark dualism that undialectically pits the formless masses against the repressive machinery of the state. The leftist deviation from Bastile's perspective concerns any political orientation which maintains that it is possible to remain formless or outside the state. It assumes that the only way one enters the state is as interiorized noise, and this internal noise is in fact the absence of the formless within the state. In a process in which the plurinational state is posited as the return of what had never left, the formless it is what always returns, but should have always already been gone. This is not the constitutive outside of hegemony. These are the moments, as García Linera himself puts it in his text on the social movements, in which the fiction of legitimacy that partitioned social space and order exclusions and inclusions cracks. And yet to call this mobilization anarchy is to have already adopted the point of view and position of the state and its order, for the mobilizations in question are nothing if not symptoms of order. They are fundamentally turned toward the violence of order. When you have to take to the streets to have access to water, you are already in constant mobilization. But that is not anarchy, that is capitalism, privatization, multinational corporations, this order that has people in constant mobilization, not anarchy. In García Linera's reading of Marx's Capital, we find a very dense but I think illuminating elaboration of this dynamic precisely in the chapter on the nation, chapter 5 of Forma Valor, Forma Comunidad. In a scene in which individuals can relate to other individuals only by way of things, the independent commodities that embody their social relations relate to one another through the value form. Now, the value form is itself a moment in which capitalist universality exists as fragmentation and separation. García Linera then comments, este movimiento esencial de la forma valor es, por tanto, lo que permite y de hecho exige que los subespacios sociales, aún delimitados de manera amorfa por la densidad del valor de uso con carácter universal, cobren necesariamente consistencia interior y una autonomía relativa para poder reflejarse en los cuerpos de valor unos en otros. Los subespacios sociales fragmentados, en tanto potenciación social de lo que sucede a nivel simple entre dos portadores de mercancías, se constituyen así en una condición ineludible del imperio social de la forma del valor. The fiction of order, the background against which social mobilizations erupt, is this fragmented empire of the value form, in which the amorphous, those zones defined by the density of use value, is of necessity made to take on an interior consistency. This passage is significant, for in it is revealed the same kind of facile opposition between the amorphous use value zone and the coercive force that makes it take on consistency, the leftist logic that Bruno is so adamant to take away from Linera. In moving onto the transformation of this dynamic, or to the possibility of a post-capitalist community, García Linera envisions nothing different happening at this level. La forma nacional no capitalista está igualmente obligada a cohesionar sus fuerzas frente a la fuerza externa, real o formalmente disgregadora. And he concludes, lo ancestral del valor de uso como componente directo de la forma social del producto del trabajo queda ligado a lo nuevo del carácter universal del valor de uso, lo que da una síntesis superadora de todo lo existente, la comunidad social universal, lo que llamamos de denominar el ayú universalizado. Is it possible to think of García Linera as a It is possible to think of García Linera as a dialectician. The fact that he takes what appeared as the obstacle for Zabaleta and the modernizing state alike, lo abigarrado, and turns it into the very essence of his recasting of the nation as plurinational state is indicative of this dialectical mode. Yet he only goes so far in this direction, for he then takes the kernel of that sublation and puts it in the exact same place that the people were held within the ideological circle of the nationalist revolutionary episteme, namely the place where the synthesis of all that exists takes place. The amorphous or the formless remains a stage on the way to coherent formalization. The revolution, this specific kind of revolution, runs parallel to the analysis of Bolivia as a country that is not modern in Linera. Liberal democracy works for countries that have gone through the process of modern individuation, in which the normative fidelities and the traditional regiments of aggregation have been eroded. Bolivia is a different case. En Bolivia la economía presenta una heterogeneidad tal que apenas 20% puede ser calificado de mercantil industrial moderno. It is worth noting the temporal dimension of this kind of argument, and furthermore that an observer as historically informed and as theoretically equipped to deal with the issue of time as Javier Sanginés at one point saw this proposal the emergence of an interculturality that went beyond the functional horizon of capitalism, the state and the coloniality of power. The functional multiculturalism of late capitalism, or the cultural logic of multinational capitalism, seeks only to contemporize various other temporalities and spaces, writes Sanginés. It fails to touch on the deep historical conflicts that these asynchronies often mark in very violent ways. He observed that in the case of a radical or critical and decolonial interculturality, the point was no longer simplemente relacionar los diferentes grupos y sistemas culturales, sino que había que partir de la diferencia colonial para revertir el orden constituido. Ella es un proceso colectivo que viene desde abajo y que trabaja para integrar la sociedad al Estado. In this, Sanginés echoes García Linera's own estimation of his proposal. La monoetnicidad y mononacionalidad del Estado, esto es Linera, en una sociedad multiétnica o plurinacional, es por tanto el primer disloque de una relación eficiente y democrática entre sociedad y Estado. Could one venture, without playing into the ideological traps of the proponents of a return to neoliberalism in Bolivia, that just as the functional multiculturalism of multinational capitalism failed to deal with historical conflicts by merely contemporizing disparate realities, the plurinational state is also built to fail in dealing with this issue. The history of violence in Bolivia does not only touch on a mere contemporizing of disparate temporalities, rather it is the exposure of asynchrony as such. It is true that the temporality of the mass, and we talked about this some yesterday, has been a different kind of temporality, but ultimately García Linera's conjunctural proposal rests on the revolutionary potential of unleashing the full force of the Bolivian state as an agent of growth and development. And it is here that time comes back into the picture. En la medida en que estas distintas formas de producción técnica y organizativa de la política pertenecen a regímenes civilizatorios distintos, sus ritmos y tiempos históricos son heterogéneos, por lo que es necesario pensar en una sincronicidad puntual por periodos cortos. The example he offers is the practice of electing officials in Chapare and Potosí, where here García Linera finds a momentary punctual synchronicity in the simultaneous use of a liberal modern individual vote and a traditional communal deliberation To what extent the constitution of the plurinational state has resulted in the materialization of such an institution is still a matter of debate. However, what is already clear is that, as Javier Sanginés noted more recently in the translation of the book into English, that book Duke is going to we have returned to state capitalism, and the production of a new horizon of communal self-rule is farther off each day. The current limitations on the multitude form shows the uncertain direction of indigenous campesino nationalities that call upon their customs and traditions to defend themselves from the very same plurinational state that, as it grows more invasive and authoritarian, contravenes the norms set by its own constitution and by international treaties to which Bolivia is a signatory. Exposing the contemporaneousness of the non-contemporary, we now know, yields a difference, but one that is still intricately tied to the state's hegemony on violence. I venture that it is the specific conception of the present, or of time as present actuality, that is at the root of this result. And for this very same reason, not even Sanginés' appeal to the multitude form would make a difference in this case. Consider the way García Linera explains the revolutionary edge of the plurinational state in answering criticisms directed against an early prediction of the non-impact of the multicultural and ethnic transformations of the state. García Linera proceeds as follows. First, it is important to clarify that the question of cultural identities is separate from that of processes of civilization. First concerns languages and cultures that run transversally through various modes of production and social classes. The second concerns the superposition of various social logics of organization, of production, political, mercantilist industrial civilization, communal, etc. García Linera openly admits that the dismantling of the apparatus of ethnic domination is not necessarily an anti-capitalist or socialist fact in itself. This is, as he points out, a development that is much more in line with the development of late capitalism. Nevertheless, in the case of Bolivia, he writes, the elimination of such domination would be una gigantesca revolución decolonizadora de las relaciones políticas y económicas. To interrupt or dismantle the mode of capitalist civilizational domination is not something that can be simply decided. This can only be done, García Linera observes, through the study of the structure of real forces and potentialities of contemporary social struggles. And then he adds, el tema de la afectación de la sociedad capitalista y la posibilidad de una sociedad comunitarista no es un tema de lógica libresca, sino de lógica histórica. No se supera el capitalismo por manera de deducción teórica de un esquema conceptual, sino por el seguimiento del movimiento real que se desenvuelve ante nuestros ojos. El que el comunitarismo social pueda superar el capitalismo es un hecho que tiene que escudriñarse en los acontecimientos históricos y en las luchas reales de las comunidades. García Linera sees the plurinational state not as a theoretical construction, but as an intervention in a political conjuncture which takes its point of departure from the correlation of real and potential forces. But in addition, this point of departure is in itself a tacit formalization of time, of the present. To be more precise, the hope, he concludes, is to combine modern and traditional institutions. Temporal asynchrony at the heart of the plurinational state is the interiorization and sublation of an obstacle which, becoming the content of the state form, creates the temporality that is thus formalized as not modern. The state will be becoming the content of the state form creates the conditions for Bolivia to become contemporaneous with itself. The state will be the ontological synthesis of Bolivia, mirroring its true image. On one level, the temporality that is thus formalized is not modern, if by modern we understand a capitalist homogenizing and single empty time. But this would be to have but into the ideological image of itself that an Eurocentric modernity has tried in vain to impose on the world. On a different level, however, it is also possible to understand this coevenness in the materialist manner that García Linera proposes. Then it would be a matter of a clarified image of modernity, where modern now means the efficient management of all the different temporalities that accrue in a singular point. Nevertheless, in both cases, what is at issue is the becoming contemporaneous with itself of Bolivia. Not only does this not make it possible to delve into the historical conflicts that are coded into these very temporalities, it exacerbates them by projecting modernity, pluritemporal and plurinational as it may be, as the telos of the community. Anything that does not move in line with this tendency is then excluded from its present. The formless, it would be the primitive in this narrative. It matters little whether the plurinational state is achieved or partially or completely or not at all. Once this modernizing scheme is put in place as the horizon of the moment, the common, the communal, everything that is deemed traditional is itself changed, sundered from itself, just as the state interiorizes the asynchrony of the new plurinational, so too must the communities become divided from themselves in order to make way for the violence inscribed in its becoming part of the hegemonic makeup of the state. A necessary shift in the lines demarcating alliances and disputes begins to take shape, and the result is as violent as ever. In the process, the community form becomes exposed as an idealist or utopian projection which served as the imagined answer to the problem of the value form of capitalism. The value form, or capitalist logics, can only ever do one thing to the community form: fragment it and distort it. That is what capitalism does. It is called subsumption. Relations between people become relations between objects, and to imagine that it is possible to have it any other way is sheer voluntarism.